look at demining efforts in Ukraine and the Danube River. And more than a century after its debut, the Remembrance Poppy gets a makeover. This time it's plastic-free. See you after the break.
Below the knee, after a landmine he was working on blew up beneath him. By May of this year, he was back at work. With the help of his prosthetic limb, he was once again sweeping for mines and defusing them.
Of course, obviously, there is fear when you return and you stand next to a minefield. There is fear. But on the other hand, you know that with the help of a metal detector, a sapper spade, and special equipment, that one can move and conduct demining work.
The 37-year-old father of four is one of 14 sappers who returned to their demining jobs in a national police unit of around 100, despite being wounded.
I saw people with artificial limbs. I saw them moving, even taking part in sporting activities, living a very active life. And then I understood it is possible to return to work, to continue working.
Ilkiv's unit was created after Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, and it focuses on humanitarian mine clearance away from the fighting. They're now operating in the regions of Kherson and Kharkiv, chunks of which were recaptured from Russia last year. 4 of their sappers have been killed in blasts, and 16 wounded. One of those injured is 51-year-old Valery Onul, who lost his leg in a blast in November last year.
I lifted myself up, looked down, and one of my legs was gone. I moved the toes of my other leg. The leg seemed fine. By then, the guys got to me. They started pulling me out. I tried to help with my good leg. I moved bit by bit and managed to get myself out without triggering the other mines that were there.
Just like Ilkiv, he's back at work. With his morale unshaken, he says he knew, even in the immediate aftermath of the blast, that he would return to mine clearance work. Ukraine estimates that about a third of the country is now strewn with mines, potentially dangerous war detritus. Kiev fears it could take decades to clear the area.
Staying with the demining efforts, military divers from several EU countries have been practicing how to retrieve unexploded munitions from the Danube's riverbed. The exercise is designed to hone their skills
under this nuclear deal. And so, no, Congressman, I'm not saying this $6 billion was used to fund October 7th. That's factually inaccurate. But a posture of appeasement for 2.5 years that emboldens this regime. A summer negotiated secret nuclear understanding that allows this regime to say, well, the Americans are off the table. They're afraid of us. They're deterred. We've already cut a pact with Saudi Arabia, too, through the Chinese earlier in the year. Now we can turn all of our sights on Israel, the only country in the Middle East operating inside of Iran to stop that nuclear program. Now we can activate all of our terror tentacles that we, the IRGC, coordinate in Beirut, a cell coordinating Hezbollah, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad. That's what we need to come together to say, let's lock down these resources. Let's turn our posture from appeasement to deterrence, to pressure. That is how we take on the terror tentacles of Tehran. Look forward to your questions today. Thank you so much for holding this hearing. I know that Qatar came up yesterday. There may be a hostage deal today involving Qatar. I think it's important we address that in the double game Qatar plays. But I look forward to your questions.
We're tuned in to the House Ranking Member Green for having me and distinguished members of the committee. Over the past decade, the Islamic Republic of Iran has spent more than $20 billion to support foreign terror groups in the Middle East. It has spent tens of billions of its own dollars on its own terror operations. And I think it's important to understand when the Islamic Republic chants death to Israel, they chant death to America, they are really deadly serious about those chants. And we learned that 2 weeks ago. And Mr. Chairman, you are correct. This is not a partisan issue. There really ought to be. They would not distinguish between Republicans and Democrats when they target us, and they don't in their ongoing assassination plots on U.S. soil. Hamas's attack on Israel was only possible because of the increased funding from the Iranian regime over the last couple of years, not just in the last couple of months, but over the last couple of years. Historically, Iran has provided $100 million to Hamas. In the past year, that has increased to $350 million. And I think it's important to understand how they got to the position of being able to increase those funds. Today, Iran provides Hamas 93% of its military budget. That funding allowed Hamas to lay low over the last year and prepare for these sneak attacks. Iran also trained 500 Hamas fighters inside Iran as recently as September. I think that is certainly a contributing factor to the success of their operations. And the regime could afford this largesse because of the problems with financing that have really flooded in, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman. $80 billion at least in oil sales since the beginning of 2021. The $10 billion that we'll discuss from Iraq, facilitated by State Department waivers, which I saw what you submitted into the record yesterday. They are very strange for the material needs of the Iranian people. They will always prioritize terror. And the United States should not aid the regime in this effort. A few recommendations. Specifically, Congress should force the executive branch to enforce its existing oil sanctions against shipping companies, tanker companies, ports, refiners, insurance companies. There are over 300 tankers facilitating trade in Iranian oil which are not sanctioned today. The same and these sanctions need to be mandatory, not discretionary. The same applies to Iran's, the United States sectoral sanctions against Iran's metals and petrochemical exports. Those sanctions have really not been enforced in the past 30 months. Second, Congress should work to bring an end to these ongoing energy waivers that we provide to Iraq, and make sure that those funds can't be laundered in China. This is a really serious terror financing threat. This issue has gone on for a long time, multiple administrations. And I think it's incumbent on Congress to find a solution with the executive branch on how we can wean Iraq off of Iranian energy independence, but then try to bring this to an end fast. Third, the United States must claw back the $6 billion provided to the Qatari Fund for Iran last month. It has not been dispersed yet. My concern, based on Iranian budgeting principles, is that they plan out their foreign currency payments months in advance, and they were planning to draw down on this, and we're in the process of moving funds around until just now, I think. The deal we made with Iran in August and September became irrelevant the moment they funded the slaughter of 30 Americans in Israel last month, and took a dozen more Americans hostage. We should not view that deal as having any legitimacy anymore. And I think the other point that's important to know is the regime has a long history of pilfering food and medicine to resell in the black market in Iraq and Afghanistan. The proceeds, even if we gave them food and medicine, would likely go to terror or be stolen by the regime elite. And so I believe Congress should rescind the September 11th waiver to formally and permanently freeze those funds and ultimately work to provide the funds to the victims of terror. I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
We are tuned in to the House Financial Services Committee hearing titled Moving the Money, Understanding the Iranian Regime's Access to Money Around the World, how they use it to fund terrorism.
Right, that is held by the House Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee. And we just heard from the House Committee's Congressman Patrick McHenry speaking about his concerns and what he wants to know and what he recommends.
That's right. We're talking about U.S. sanctions on Iran that have gone back to 1979, since the Islamic Revolution. These sanctions were originally intended to compel Iran from supporting acts of terror, to persuade them to end their nuclear program, which from what we're hearing is not happening, and to limit Iran's strategic power in the Middle East.
And McHenry did say that he thinks, these issues with sanctions have occurred across many administrations, but he did point to a few significant changes in the past 30 or so months under the Biden administration, and we'll look into those as well. He pointed to the Iranian regime's intentions, and that's worth reiterating, which is that really, Iran intends to also destroy America. And he says, when they chant death to Israel, they're really chanting death to America, and that we should be taking that very seriously.
He also talked about how the Iranian regime has given Hamas $350 million in the past year, and that's a significant increase. Right now, they've been funding 93% of Hamas's military budget, giving them an opportunity to make their plans for the attack that we saw on October 7th.
And also training them directly.
And just a correction, the witness is Gabriel Narenha. That was not Congressman Patrick McHenry.
Okay, thanks for correcting the record there. We also want to look at Hamas's, so I mentioned Hamas was training, Iran was training Hamas fighters.
Elite fighters.
Right, even as late as September. So they were really targeting this attack and supporting it. An interesting point that was brought up just now was that Iran may be laundering the money that they're getting through China to get rid of humanitarian requirements. So what we know from many sources and from experts who study this extensively is that the Iranian regime really puts its own people last and puts acts of terror around the world first. So we can expect that any funds that come towards them will be used in that manner, at least according to many observers on the issue. And that statement in regards to China was made in relation to the $10 billion that got transferred from Iraq to Iran with the permission of the U.S. through waivers.
Right, and we're talking about this hearing where Iran, how is Iran getting the money that they use to fund terrorism? Well, one of the ways is that they sell oil to China. While China denies that they're buying oil from Iran, industry experts say that it's been happening to the tune of 1.5 million barrels per day in August, and that's up from about 900,000 barrels per day in the 7 months prior to August. So a really significant influx of cash for Iran from China, oil sales to China, money that we know Iran is using to fund Hamas. So it's all coming full circle here. We'll have more on the House Committee's hearing on the ways that Iran gets their money and uses it to fund terrorism after the break.
Kidnapping. The survivor of several such attempts tells Congress her story. Who's leaving the U.S. may be as important as who's coming in, according to a security expert. How the U.S. may be helping terrorists in Iran's nuclear program. And police arrest a man for breaking into a California home and threatening to kill the family. He reportedly shouted "Free Palestine" during the incident. Details on this and more when we return.
I don't feel safe here at home anymore. My family doesn't feel safe anymore.
Masih Alinejad is an Iranian-American activist. She was forced to leave Iran for being critical of the regime, and she now lives in the U.S., where she fears for her life.
Iranian regime were plotting to kidnap me and take me from Brooklyn by a speedboat to a cargo ship bound for Venezuela and then to Iran. To you, maybe it's a scary movie, but to us, this is the reality. They did that to my colleague in France, and they executed him in Iran.
Alinejad said she's had to move over a dozen times under FBI supervision, and she believes the Iranian regime is responsible. Alinejad says the Biden administration's response has been inadequate because it isn't holding Iran accountable. She says these threats are national security threats.
The Iranian regime's threats to the homeland are real and are growing. They've sought to conduct cyber attacks on our state and local governments and private industry. They've plotted to target and assassinate individuals inside the United States, including former Trump officials.
Congressman Mark Green says that a record number of illegal immigrants are entering the U.S. through the southern border. He's concerned about how Iran could take advantage of that and infiltrate the country to commit acts of terrorism. Former State Department official Nathan Sales believes Iran may have already done so.
Iranian-linked terrorists have been found in the United States. I mentioned Hezbollah, 128 Hezbollah operatives arrested over the years by the FBI. Within that population of however many millions or hundreds of thousands of known gotaways, we should not assume that they are all perfectly clean.
Sales says the Iranian regime hides behind proxies instead of doing things themselves. These proxies include terrorist groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iraqi militias. Witnesses at the hearing said Iran also uses criminal organizations, like the European crime syndicate that tried to kill Masih Alinejad, and the Mexican drug cartels that tried to kill John Bolton. Faye Quarter, NTD News.
All this while Iran continues to develop its nuclear weapons program. How is sensitive technological information flowing to Iran, and what can the U.S. do to address the threat? We spoke with a retired special agent and diplomat and author of the book Switched On. Eric, Karen, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you on the show.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
With the Israel-Hamas war ongoing, there's been a lot of scrutiny of Iran possibly supporting the Hamas terrorist group. And now this comes after the recent Iran hostage swap, where we also unfroze $6 billion. Now, the U.S. administration is saying Iran can't access those funds due to current events. How do you see the Iran deal fitting in with this war in Israel?
Well, I think it's a travesty that we did this deal. Iran has declared war against Israel and the U.S. They're responsible for the deaths of dozens of U.S. soldiers in Iraq. And we should not be negotiating with a state sponsor of terror. It only emboldens them. And we see what they're doing today. They have proxies all around the Middle East. They have militias, some 19 militia groups all over the Middle East, targeting the U.S., targeting U.S. servicemen. We essentially are at war. They declared war against us, and we need to take the gloves off against Iran and start taking the threat seriously before it's too late.
And Eric, on the point of negotiations, the U.S. has celebrated the Americans we got back, but what about the Iranians we released? What do we know about them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think it was a fair deal. I don't think Donald Trump would have settled for this deal because, we essentially gave to Iran international arms traffickers who were providing sensitive military technology for their WMD programs. That's weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, biological, chemical, missile technology that is facing us, that we are the target of those WMD weapons in Israel. And so these individuals should not have been released. They should have been charged with espionage because they harmed the interests of the U.S. They were providing sensitive military technology to Iran. And we see today some of that technology is being used today against U.S. servicemen in drones, in missiles. We think about border security as just inbound. We need to think about border security as what's leaving America, destined for terrorist countries such as Iran.
And on the point of the technology,